Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that we ran on in 2020. And today we have a guest, a Polish activist, Ewa Pospieszynska. You're going to have to pronounce that for people.
It is a
And I'll
difficult one.
introduce her in a second. I just want to follow up briefly on what I was talking about last Saturday when I warned about Elon Musk and his minions staging an electronic coup to take control of federal government computer systems from civil service employees in the Treasury Department, Office of Personnel Management, and other government agencies. And these actions make the January 6th coup attempt in 2021 look like Bush leaguers. And this is an attempt at state capture by a section of the billionaire class, beyond the reach of law or democratic accountability. The takeover of government systems accelerated over the rest of last weekend and into this week. And Musk's cadre in this coup are a bunch of racist brats and juvenile delinquents who are Musk's proteges, as young as 19 years old. And they now have control, or did for us, there was a court decision today, of government disbursements and any private information you've provided to government to get income in your income tax refunds, or to receive direct deposit for anything from a student loan to SNAP to Medicaid to Medicare to Social Security. They have access to your Social Security number, your bank account numbers, and your health records. And Musk has already boasted that he has blocked payments. He boasted on Twitter to some 8 entities that were entitled to get payments. And I think, what I want to call these MAGA Republicans, I want to call them maggot Republicans, because they're eating out our public services and our public data from the inside of the government. And all of this is blatantly illegal. And we've already won. Lawyers have gone to court, states attorneys general, and won injunctions in the courts. The most important probably was this morning when a federal court judge ordered Musk and his minions to stop accessing Treasury Department payment and data systems and to destroy all copies of records and computer code that they may have taken. The lower courts are likely to be on our side in this. Biden actually got more federal judges appointed in his term than Trump did in his first term. So the MAGA Republicans don't control all of the federal courts. They do control the Supreme Court, which is a problem. So the big question coming up is whether Trump will comply with these court injunctions or defy them. And there's precedent for that. Andrew Jackson, a racist, slave-owning president who's one of Trump's favorites, he told the Marshall Court that ruled against the Indian Removal Act that removed Cherokees from Georgia on the infamous Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. Jackson said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And Stalin said something similar. He sarcastically told the French prime minister in 1935, who was asking for Stalin's support to mobilize Catholics against the Nazis. And Stalin said, the Pope, how many divisions does he have? So, federal marshals will be outgunned by the military and law enforcement if they obey Trump instead of the law. So, that could lead to civil war. We're in a very serious situation. And I just hope everyone is in a local group working with others to organize resistance to this assault on our democracy. So I leave it at that. This is an ongoing crisis. And with that note of concern and warning, let's turn to Poland, where the left green has achieved at least a foothold in national politics, a national parliament in a pretty conservative country, and see what we can learn and use from that in our own struggles. So our guest today is Ewa Pospieszynska. I think
that's very, Pospieszynska, very well done.
Okay. She's based in London, and she's active in the international branch of the Polish party Razem, which means together in English. And Razem was founded in 2015 as a new left party by social movement activists and former Greens and Young Socialists. As I mentioned, it has representation in the national parliament since 2019. And Ewa is a marketing specialist with good knowledge of the publishing and media industries. She has a bachelor's degree from Surrey University in London, a master's degree in sociology from the London School of Economics. She was one of the organizers of the big abortion rights protests in Poland in 2020. And at some point here, we'll put a link to an article she co-authored about that. And we'll put links to Razem and the other international Green Left alliances that Razem is a part of. Also some links to articles by Ewa. And she's got a podcast called Pollcast. And so we'll put that in the chat as we go along here. But one of the parties on my recent trip to Eastern Europe that I most wanted to meet was Razem in Poland. Because, their politics are much like the eco-socialist politics we're talking about. And they've been very strong on solidarity with Ukraine. But it didn't work out in Poland for a lot of reasons I won't go into. But I was fortunate when I got to London to be working with the eco-socialist who's active in the Ukraine Solidarity campaign that they have, Sasha Ismail, who connected me with Ewa. And by the way, later in the month, we'll have Sasha on to talk about Ukraine solidarity around the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. That's March 1st. And also we'll have a Ukrainian socialist historian, Vladislav Storodubtsev, on the podcast on February 22nd to talk about the situation in Ukraine today, and also about his specialty in history, which is the centrality in Ukrainian history of the left to their independence movement in the 19th century up through the independent Ukrainian People's Republic from 1917 to 1920 during the Russian Revolution, which is his, what he really writes a lot about. So, thanks to Sasha Ismail, Ewa and I got together and we had a great conversation over dinner in London about Polish, U.S., and international politics. And, I told her then I thought she should come on my podcast to talk about those things and share it with more people. So welcome, Ewa. And, why don't you just start by telling us about your background and how you came to left politics and to Razem in Poland?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm very glad to be invited and to speak about Poland a bit. Well, my journey to be on the left is actually quite complicated. We don't have time to dive into it properly, but let me just say the long story short. I'm from a very small, quite conservative town in central Poland. And so, I was quite my upbringing was kind of quite conservative. My dad is a very devoted Christian. I would go to church every Sunday, and that is often the case for still lots of Poles. And then also, state kind of indoctrination is quite strong in terms of religion lessons in Poland, like public schools. Religion lessons are often taught by priests and nuns, and they are very much they start with a prayer. So you don't really learn about religion in terms of different types of religions, but it's very much indoctrination from an early age, which is changing now, but it's still the case. And obviously church is a very strong kind of political influence in Poland as well, which we're seeing even with how they were working with Law and Justice when Law and Justice was in power, and now how they're trying also to influence politics, and particularly their efforts to ban abortion in Poland, which partially were quite successful actually. And so actually abortion is where I kind of started to organize quite actively, and I joined Razem in 2020, which is also a very strategic moment, because that's when big abortion protests all over Poland happened after Law and Justice kind of tried to ban and restrict even further access to abortion through the Constitutional Court, which is kind of an equivalent of Supreme Court in the US. And they did manage to take away one of the exceptions about fetal abnormalities, which was one of those kind of exceptions that were used most often for legal abortions in Poland. And that sparked a very big wave of protests across Poland, which was, both. It started obviously with like demanding abortion. It started the demands kind of started expanding to like we should actually have free access to abortion without any exceptions. So like more progressive stance to what was the reality even before Law and Justice came into power. And then you also saw that those demands started to expand into like a wider kind of political campaign around basically removing Law and Justice from the government, because they, there's lots of controversies around how they were governing and how they are tried to limit, kind of like, for instance, implement some control over like the law system and lots of corruption and stuff like that, but also just general criticism and like lack of satisfaction with the way things are in Poland, and that kind of, there was like a very progressive strand of that protest. So they were organized by this campaign called All Poland Women's Strike, but Razem was also very crucial in bringing people together and then like having actual structures around those protests. And I happened to be in Poland at the time because of the pandemic. So normally I was I live in the UK, but I came back during the pandemic, and then the protests started happening, and I was already kind of broadly saying on the left, but I wasn't very much involved on the Polish left. And then that's how I joined Razem. And it was also quite interesting because All Poland Women's Strike was like very important during this time, but you couldn't join it. There was no membership. And so I looked for somewhere where I can actually where there are some proper structures where you can kind of get involved and then keep up the momentum beyond just the wave of protests, which always kind of comes to an end at some point. And so that's why I joined, and that's how my kind of focus around that like about women's rights kind of started. And in terms of like just generally like the left traditions that I'm involved with, like I'm very much like against the campus kind of way of thinking. So like I look at like third ways of like not just kind of black and white, like I don't know, the US and Russia and like the two imperialist powers, but I think we should look at like at politics more complex way. And I think Razem is also a place where you are able to think in those ways, and that's something that I've realized when I started getting involved in the British left, that there are lots of problems with like campus way of thinking, and so I started reading more about like just socialist theory and people like Hall Draper, Max Hartman, and analyzing also the lessons in terms of what happened with the Soviet Union, why did it go the way it did. Obviously, as someone who is from Poland, very much affected by that. And we still, I think you even mentioned that in one of your episodes, how it is a problem in Eastern Europe in general when you kind of identify and say that you're a socialist openly. Like people get very like wary of that because they have that bad experience of communism, so-called communism. And so Razem also struggles with that often, trying to kind of like appeal to people who might have had bad experiences during when we were influenced by the Soviet Union, but also being very firmly on the left. So yeah, that's how it broadly started.
I got a whole bunch of questions I want to ask you, but why don't you briefly tell people how you join Razem as a party? In the United States, by comparison, people join parties by just telling the state which party they're in. They don't have to pay membership fees or dues. They don't have to agree to any political principles. They just tell the state which primary they want to vote in. And, people consider that democracy, but it's the insiders of the parties and the funders that pre-select who you get to vote for in the primary. Whereas I understand it in joining a party like Razem, not only do you pay membership fees or dues, you have a 3-month probationary period where, the party and you see if you're incompatible. Why don't you, describe
Yeah.
that process for people so they
Yeah.
have, something to compare what we do to?
Yeah, of course. So Razem, is very much concerned with having active membership, people who are not just blindly following, a leader or trying to just do politics in a way that is an active, we are trying, even our voters base, we're trying to engage in terms of debates, discussing our program. And so that is obviously also true for the membership. And so in order to join Razem, I mean, it's not a very difficult process, but you do have to fill in the form, or usually you contact someone from Razem, either through your local branch or through the website. You send an email and or you fill in the form on the website, and then someone contacts you to kind of discuss your interest, and usually they would encourage you to start through this kind of probation period that you mentioned. And that probation period can vary from person to person, but the recommended time is usually 3 months for you to familiarize yourself with the party, to read the program, to you also get assigned most of the time a mentor, someone who you can talk to, who you can ask questions, who will send you some resources and links, so you basically have an awareness of what you're joining and what it means. And as you said, also there is an obligation once you become a member to pay a membership fee. So that can also vary. That varies depending on your salary, and there is no there is no required amount you have to pay, but there are some suggested kind of tiers depending on your salary. And yes, paying membership is actually very important for you to stay in the party. And then you also get access to, I think, what is what a very good way of doing internal kind of communication. You get access to a platform where you can, it's divided into different channels and different groups. You can see different fractions within the party, and you can basically communicate with all the members. So first of all, you have access to the national and the whole of Razem in terms of all the membership, but also you can have specific smaller groups, for instance, your local branch, and then you can basically decide which levels you kind of organize at, and you can see all of that. And also on your probation period, you already have access to that. And then, within Razem, we do care about internal democracy. The most important way for us to decide things is our annual Congress. That's where obviously some delegates come together to discuss the most important events, our program, our plans for the future. I was actually a delegate back in October 2024, and came from London, from my London branch. To with other members to be able to vote and participate. But there are also other bodies within Razem that facilitate that internal democracy, and you can also participate in meetings on different levels. So it is very transparent, very democratic in that way. So yeah, very, very good way of organizing, I think.
Okay, I hope Greens in America are listening and thinking about, how we can improve our organization, because I think there's some, things we can take from that. So why don't you talk about why Razem formed? Out of social movements, elements of the Green Party and the Young Socialists, and why it was formed as a new left party as opposed to the old left.
Yes. So, again, the landscape that we've described, I've briefly mentioned, with Poland being quite I would say there's certain generational trauma in terms of the left. And, during the transformation period, there was a party called SLD. And so that party existed until recently, and now it's rebranded as left. And that's, that was a party with people who were, kind of, it seemed like they are on the left, and they're focused, concerned with workers, and with a lot of them were like somehow engaged in Solidarność during like the 80s, and they were often quite actively fighting the kind of like so-called communist regime, but then it actually turned out that lots of them were just carrierists, people who kind of took advantage of their position during transformation as well, would kind of personally benefit from privatization of the industry, and those there were lots of scandals around that. And so this party actually very eagerly like kind of adopted the neoliberal concept of economy, and Poland very quickly kind of entered this kind of free market meritocratic kind of ideology, and so although they were in principle the left, they didn't really live up to that. And so there was a growing dissatisfaction amongst like progressives, as you mentioned, like often like students movements. So one of our kind of founders and one of co-leaders of Razem, Adrian Zandberg, was, for instance, like a very active organizer in the students movement against privatization and like marketization of higher education and against fees. So again, for some of the listeners, it might be a surprise, but in Poland, higher education is still free. You do not have to pay any fees. And, we wanted to keep it that way. And then we managed to keep it that way for now. Obviously, there are still, big problems with like not enough funding and very bad like working conditions in the academia, but still, you can study without paying any fees. And so Adrian Zandberg was one of the students who fought for that, together with Marcelina Zawisza, who's also one of Razem's MPs, and they together with other progressives and like organizers within like local also structures, decided to set up the party in 2015. And that was also, quite a crucial time for Poland, because Law and Justice just came to power after Civic Platform, who was in power for the 8 years. And so it was quite like an important moment. There were also presidential election happening. Again, we're actually having presidential election this year. And so, it kind of came as a real alternative and a proper left that will represent workers, that will focus on like, ordinary people's kind of problems, but also that has a proper program around like things like, climate change, things like housing, things like funding public healthcare, which again exists in Poland, but is very underfunded and risks being privatized within the next 20, 40 years, depending on how bad it will go. And so it was a very fresh voice, very kind of bold voice that you couldn't ever really see before on the Polish arena in that kind of way. And it did manage to attract quite a lot of voters, but not enough for Razem to have a parliamentary representation. So in Polish system, you need to kind of go over the 5% threshold in order to have MPs, and Razem got a little bit over 3% in that election, which meant it got some funding from the state to kind of keep the party going. It kind of could get some money to run the party, but it wasn't able to have representatives. And this is also why we were kind of having internal debates how to make Razem kind of also have a parliamentary presence. And although this is not, I think, the most important goal, it was quite important for us to have some MPs, and that did happen in 2019. But unfortunately, for that to happen, we did get into a coalition agreement with the so-called Lewica, so the left, which consisted of the SLD that I mentioned, the party that used to be kind of in power during the transformation period, and which is quite bad in all sorts of ways. And we kind of, conceded. We were like, okay, we might try working with them in order to first maybe try and influence them, within the coalition, try to maybe improve the way they operate, the policies that they have, the program that they have, by debating it internally with them, but also obviously trying to, get those votes and have that threshold kind of finally overcome. And we did. We had a parliamentary representation, and then again in 2024. So last year there were big general elections, and we again ran with them from the same list, and we managed to get into parliament. But since then we actually left that coalition. So we're no longer in Lewica in a broader sense, and we kind of exist again as Razem on its own for all sorts of reasons I might dive into in a moment. But yes, that's basically how it all started, and what these were the principles kind of behind setting up the party.
So why don't you talk about the current political situation in Poland? You got the presidential election you've mentioned, but it's in an international context of the rise of the far right, Trump in America, and you have, strong right parties in Poland. So how are you dealing with that? And what's your perspective on those questions?
Yeah. I mean, it is obviously a very challenging time, and the left, unfortunately, is not as strong in Europe or anywhere else as we would like to see it. But, it's not the reason to not do things. Actually, it's quite the opposite. And so, there is quite a lot of, I think, in terms of like Poland, the election I mentioned, general election that happened last year, it had an unprecedented turnout of 74.4%. Which is really unheard of. It's not even like the first free election during after the transformation didn't have that turnout. So that kind of shows you how there is certain mobilization in the society, and there's a kind of appetite for change and dissatisfaction with the current situation. And obviously Poland, we ended this 8-year parliamentary majority held by Law and Justice, which obviously made headlines for being quite conservative and banning abortion, restricting it further, and also doing all sorts of other things such as horrible migration policy, dehumanizing migrants on the Polish-Belarusian border, actually causing deaths of people who tried to cross that border. They built a wall, and the hope was, I think, for a lot of people to just see some progressive force back in power in Poland, but also just kind of showing that people can mobilize, and especially on the back of those protests in 2020 around women's rights. But also, yes, you could see there was this whole debate about migration that Civic Platform, which eventually won this election, kind of initially said, oh yeah, this is a horrible thing that's happening on the Polish-Belarusian border. Since then, they actually started speaking using kind of more of a far right kind of language, and Donald Tusk, who is leading the Civic Platform party, he since really last year just completely adopted the approach that a lot of the far right in Europe has towards migration, and so the basically the landscape is that it's there's lots of kind of cynical scapegoating, and that is very much visible in Poland as well. And there were different forces so to just kind of say what's happening in terms of the current government in Poland is led by Civic Coalition and former Prime Minister Donald Tusk. He's the current Prime Minister, sorry. But what I'm saying is that he is he was in politics. He was a big name in Poland before Law and Justice came into power, and then he came back kind of after his stand in European Union, and now he's leading this coalition government, which actually consists of quite different parties. So the very small Green representation that's in the parliament is also within this coalition, for instance. But the shameful thing about this coalition is that they run on this quite progressive program, promising things like abortion, promising things like being kind of decisive to change things about and whole thing with coal in Poland, and trying to introduce measures to actually minimize the climate change and actually treat it seriously. So they had that in the program when they were campaigning, and then the moment they won, you could see that there was a certain shift towards actually just doing the usual that they used to do back when they were in power, and not doing very much. And so this is actually why Razem did not join the coalition government, because there were negotiations happening after the election, and different parties in that coalition were supposed to discuss what's going to happen and kind of come up with a coalition agreement. And Razem did participate in those negotiations, but then it decided not to join, because none of our demands were met, including budgetary demands. We were offered seats in the government and in different ministries, but we said we cannot take them because we simply won't be able to pursue our program and our promises. And as it happened, the current coalition basically abandoned a lot of those progressive promises and is turning towards the right. And I think this is a trend that we're seeing across the board, right? We're seeing liberal kind of or kind of center right parties kind of turning more towards the right and trying to appeal to the electorate that is not very progressive, but they're not trying to challenge or argue for any of the kind of progressive policies, and almost as if they're just they've decided to just compete with the far right on who's going to be more conservative. And so we've seen those concessions, and Razem decided to be very much firmly against that, right? So we not only didn't join the coalition government, but we also left the coalition with Lewica, who did join the government, to challenge them more. And that actually caused a lot of problems within Razem itself. One of our key members, our co-leader, Magda Biejat, actually left Razem and took with her 4 other MPs in October 2024, just before our Congress, just before our most important kind of democratic, as I mentioned, body met to officially decide things. And now she's also running actually in this presidential election. And although she didn't formally join the Lewica party, she's kind of an independent. She's still obviously running from their list. So it's kind of this really weird situation. And, and she is someone who would, for instance, argue that we have to, find a dialogue between, different people in liberals, including liberals, and kind of need to enter that government in order to have some sort of agency in it, which is frankly bollocks. You can't really do much as an independent MP or a group of MPs, and also they are not even pushing for the things that they promised. So it's just conceding, and so that's what we've been seeing across the board. It's not the whole story. Obviously, there is quite a lot of struggle and resistance. There is quite a lot of things happening. There are different movements that we will probably talk about soon, such as youth movements. There are different groups that are trying to organize, and also alliances that are kind of more international left alliances, right? So Razem was like discussing, and then eventually decided to join the European Left Alliance for the People and the Planet that was set up last year. It's also been quite active in all sorts of like kind of movements, and even the fact that Razem has international branches, right? The fact that I, as someone who's based in London, can be quite active in Razem despite not living in Poland, I think kind of says something about the way we try to do politics, and how we try to think about a broader picture.
So let's put the links to the European Left Alliance for the People of the Planet and another international association Razem's part of called the Central Eastern European Green Left Alliance. And people can check out what their politics are about. So your presidential candidate, what is his program and his goals? And you mentioned him before, so tell us a little bit more about him.
Yes, so Adrian Zandberg, he, he's an MP, and he's been kind of active in politics, as I said, since he was a student. He's a historian, and very openly kind of left wing, and sometimes even attacked by the far right on the basis that he's a Marxist. I mean, I don't know if he calls himself openly a Marxist anymore, but at some point he did, and he faced very big backlash. And actually, Razem once even faced some accusations from Law and Justice for being communist. And officially in Poland, you can't have a program that's communist. That is illegal because of like the meaning that communism carries in Poland. So we were even facing those kind of things. So he's very much someone who's focused on workers' rights, very much into funding public services, especially education, healthcare. He's also pro-migration. He is very much involved in all sorts of kind of like green kind of initiatives in terms of basically having that green change in Poland. And so that in terms of his actual concrete kind of demands, let me just open the website so I don't make up any numbers. But he's very he's very much talking about the day-to-day issues that Poles and people generally across Europe face. So things like housing, right? The fact that it's basically impossible to afford a house. In the rents are very expensive. As someone who rents as well, you often don't have much rights, and that's true also in Poland. And he's talking also about those really bad types of contracts. We call them śmieciówki, so kind of trashy contracts in terms of employment, where companies try to go around employment law and basically keep people very precarious. And so he is very much connected to all these struggles. He's someone who goes to strikes when they happen. He is in contact with people in different workplaces and very connected, rank and file in Poland. But also he is a very good kind of speaker who can argue those points very convincingly. And so even when back in 2015 when he was running actually for the first time to be president, which obviously he has no chance of winning, but that wasn't the point. The point was to platform Razem and its program. He won, I think, the debate that happened and amongst different candidates, because he is so good at kind of translating the program that we have and speaking about it. And in terms of things that have been happening during the campaign, we've seen, as I said, with Civic Platform, this quite rapid move towards the far right, kind of narrative. So, for instance, very recently, Rafał Trzaskowski, who is a mayor of Warsaw and quite a prominent politician, who is also a candidate of Civic Platform and likely to win, he recently attacked Ukrainians who are in Poland, which basically echoes, again, the Konfederacja Party, the far-right, ultra-far-right party in Poland. And he said something about taking away any social support that Ukrainians in Poland receive if they're not working. Basically, suggesting that they're just here in Poland to benefit from social benefits and shouldn't be able to get that state support. And obviously Zandberg is someone who would very forcibly respond to that, say that it's unacceptable, to suggest even that there's something wrong with Ukrainians kind of being able to benefit from those programs, and also how we need that social support more generally, because it was very limited actually for years, and it's funnily enough, it's Law and Justice who introduced this 500 plus program, which was kind of child benefit, which now is 800 plus because of how inflation affected also the worth of that money. But Civic Platform maintained this program quite reluctantly, but they knew that they will face backlash if they try to take it away. But now we're seeing that they're trying to limit it to certain groups and exclude others. And so this is kind of the one of the areas where Razem tries to really be quite forceful. And other areas is definitely housing, because Civic Platform again is quite known for creating kind of good landscape for developers to build very bad quality housing and very expensive housing. And also then they had this program about loans from the banks to buy your first flat. And it was called this 0% loan, which obviously was kind of substituted by the state. But what it did in practice, and we did have it also during Law and Justice, it just put the prices of the flats higher. It just bumped them. And so Razem had this very a big campaign around opposing this program and explaining how, for instance, building social housing, good quality social housing, could be a great solution to the housing crisis, and how actually regulating the market and regulating those developers would benefit people. So very much a lot of that campaign that Zandberg is running is focusing around those issues and kind of day-to-day struggles that Poles face. But there is also that more international kind of take about the general landscape that we're facing in Europe. There's that aspect of how does Poland support Ukraine? How do we kind of respond to things like Trump in the US? How do we also respond to growing far right, both in Poland and across Europe, with Meloni, Le Pen, AfD in Germany? So we're trying to campaign on all those grounds and say why we stand for what we do, and push the harder, both liberals and the far right push towards scapegoating and limiting people's rights and basically supporting the capital. The more we're trying to find holes in their arguments and kind of push against that. But it is difficult. It is difficult for a party that is still quite small, that does not have many resources, and also Polish media landscape is not very supportive either. So a lot of the things we do is basically grassroots organizing, traveling across Poland, organizing meetings, trying to do some sort of social media campaign, and basically talking to people, trying to do it directly through workplaces, through all sorts of initiatives, and things like the women's strike in 2020. That was very, very beneficial for Razem as well, because we were very active during those protests. We had proper blocks, we had proper demands, we would often be kind of the brain of the operation, you could say. And so that obviously meant that we could recruit people and talk to them about our program more broadly. So that these are the ways we're trying to kind of influence the situation.
Well, I hope, Americans are listening. The problem we have in a presidential campaign is just getting on a damn ballot. So most of our energy goes into that thing, and the kind of grassroots organizing we talk about, we never get around to. I think
in Poland you have to collect 100K signatures, and we are still trying to reach that number. So there is also a certain, threshold you have to meet in order to have a candidate. But we're very likely to, get that. It is an achievable goal. But it does mean that our members stand outside in winter every day trying to collect signatures across Poland. And actually there's even a difficulty for me, for instance, to collect signatures abroad, because although you can vote, while living abroad, it's very hard to sign in support of the candidate, because you need to have a Polish address, which is quite a bizarre rule. And so, yes, there are also certain obstacles in Poland.
So does every party have to get 100,000 signatures?
Yes.
Okay. Because in some countries, once you're recognized, you just nominate and you're on the ballot. I didn't realize you had to do petitioning like that. You mentioned the split in the Razem, Lewica or left coalition in mid-October, and then you had your convention. I think that's why when I got to Poland in early November, Razem was busy. That's why, we really couldn't arrange a meeting. So I don't want to say like they were negligent. In fact, I know people, were trying to set something up. And listening to you talk about the issues that, Seinberg is raising, I was just thinking, geez, I wish we'd had a candidate in our presidential election that did that on the housing question, which is a huge crisis all over the United States. And, it didn't happen. I mean, the Green program had it, but, our candidate didn't really emphasize that. And maybe we can put this in the chat now. I had an article I've mentioned in the last couple of podcasts that just came out in New Politics called A Political Paradox. And the subtitle is, why did a left-leaning public elect a right-wing president? And it goes into all the exit polls and other polling data and tries to understand that question. But one of the conclusions is Harris lost because she didn't speak to people's economic concerns, and Trump did, even if what he said was just slogans and kind of Bill Clinton, I feel your pain stuff. But Harris seemed indifferent. And, the Green campaign focused on Palestine justifiably, but didn't get much to the economic class issues. I'm just wishing, your candidate good luck, and hopefully it can have an impact, because the rise of the far right, I mean, I heard that when I did speak to people in Poland, that's what they wanted to talk about. Trump had just been elected. Same thing when I went further west, to Czechia, and then Germany, and then London and Ireland. And I'm writing that stuff up on these dispatches from Europe that I can't believe they're not done, but I'm up to about 16, and there's probably going to be at least 10 more, because I did meet a lot of people. But anyway, let's get to the questions that were in the chat. Here we go. Andrew Hager asks, putting my typical rail passion aside, I'd like to ask how Social Security is managed in Poland.
Social Security?
Yeah, old age pensions.
Yes. So obviously, there is a retirement scheme, and you have the age of retirement, which it was changed quite a few times, because Civic Platform actually, when it was in power, tried to put it up, and then Law and Justice actually reversed it, and then I'm actually not sure what it is right now, but let me check it. But basically, there is a scheme, but it's not very good. I mean, we still face like a lot of elderly people, a lot of people who are retired face, problems with covering the costs of living. Most people who retire don't really have that kind of security. Obviously there are like multiple things that don't work. For instance, like the private public health system is supposed to support and be there, but actually a lot of elderly people would seek probably private healthcare as well, because it's just so hard to get to the public health system, and a lot of the medication that they need to take, for instance, wouldn't be fully kind of refunded by the state. So there are certain issues there, but it's still, there is certain type of, like you can claim like, let's say, basic salary, and kind of have that support from the state. And I'm gonna just tell you which age you have to be in Poland. I think 65 was the, yeah. So there's the division. There's actually it's 60 for women, 65 for men. There was a big debate to kind of try to not have that division there, but yeah, that's how it's working currently. I hope that's a good answer to this question.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think the socialist left needs to educate people on is we can win progressive reforms, New Deal type reforms, social democratic type reforms, like Social Security or old age pensions, like public health care, like public housing or social housing. But if it's still a capitalist society where the wealthy have disproportionate economic and political power, they can roll that back. They can privatize the public programs. We're seeing that with Medicare. The policy of the Biden administration was to privatize all the plans for all the beneficiaries of Medicare by 2030. So everybody would be forced, everybody would go on to Medicare Advantage, which is offered by private insurance companies, and they get paid by Medicare. And now the plan of the Trump administration is to force us to do that. And that's what happens when you get progressive programs passed, but the power is still in the hands of the capitalists.
Yeah.
And that's why we need the full economic democracy and political democracy of a democratic socialism, which is a discussion we should be having on the left, although we're so far to the right in this country that just even demanding Medicare for all is seen as a radical demand. But it's something we need to be aware of. Anyway, let's see what other questions we have. Andrew Hager, what about those who are disabled physically and mentally, who are unemployed or seek job training, but rely on Social Security benefits or whatever social benefits you have until they are qualified for employment? It's a big issue here.
Yeah, it actually gets pretty bad around that. So I mean, there are some unemployment, like support for unemployed. There are some, bodies that are supposed to like support people to like find, job opportunities and some training. But in terms of like actually disabled, especially like mentally kind of people who have like mental health issues, there's very little support, or it's just marginal. And then also actually with people generally with disabilities often have to rely on their primary carers, and those primary carers are often they get some allowances from the state, but they never are enough to cover the costs. That, for instance, there are those stupid rules where if you're a primary carer, you can't also work beyond a certain amount of hours, but also you can't have a salary beyond a certain threshold, which is quite low. And so there was this actually very loud case of a writer. Her name is Agnieszka Szpila, who has disabled daughters. And so she had to refuse a writing prize, very prestigious writing prize, because if she accepted it, she would be deprived of that social support for taking care of her daughters. So there are all sorts of issues there, and usually very underfunded. And so Razem actually has demands around that and wants to have budget that would enable increasing this kind of social security support for all sorts of groups. Yeah.
Chris Blankenhorn, how are the Polish people reacting to Trump's threats of EU tariffs?
Whew, I mean, I don't actually know the answer. I mean, as I said, I'm based in London and don't have maybe like an immediate, access to those reactions. I mean, within the party, within Razem, we are obviously very, very worried about Trump in general, about what he might do around Ukraine, around, obviously we've seen what he was saying about Palestine recently. It's all, the problem with him is also that he's just so unpredictable. You can't really, you don't even know how to prepare for him kind of being in power. But definitely, Razem is pro EU. We are critical of EU in terms of like we do think that the bureaucracy within the EU is quite too big, and like we want it to be like not the fortress kind of European Union that a lot of the parties are now pushing for, and we have all of our criticism around it, but we would like it to exist, and to thrive and to have some influence on it as well internally, and then push for it to be progressive. Obviously the question of tariffs in general, I mean, is quite, I think, quite a like complex one, because how effective are tariffs, and can he really harm the EU that as much as he thinks he can? I mean, I guess that's a separate question, but I mean, we definitely do fear that he will try to weaken the European Union, and we know that Putin also does try to weaken the European Union. So those things are definitely worrying.
Scout Trooper 164, Ewa, do you have any worries about Poland being influenced or invaded by foreign countries such as Russia? I know the U.S. is a wild dog right now, but is there any concern of foreign influence?
I mean, I don't personally fear, and I don't think within Razem that we don't really believe that Russia would try and invade Poland. As we can see from its invasion on Ukraine, like I think Putin did not expect that he is going to face such powerful this coalition of different but also how the way Ukrainians kind of try to fight this invasion, how successful they are, despite obviously struggling as well. I don't think he would try and go further. There are obviously attempts that Russia makes on trying to influence Polish politics, the way it tried to also influence European politics. Obviously in Hungary, Putin was quite significant, trying to kind of infiltrate the narrative a little bit, and you see that as well, I think, especially on the far right with Konfederacja party is quite anti-Ukraine, and they are, I would say, pro-Putin, and so Putin tries to maybe influence them more as well, and there are those attempts, but I wouldn't say these are very big concerns at the moment. I don't personally think we have that much of a trouble. The problem starts when big influential parties such as Civic Platform start to adopt those narratives from the far right, like Konfederacja, and then kind of echo things such as, we should limit rights of Ukrainians in Poland. That's more of a problem than direct kind of action that Putin can have.
Joanna Munley, Ewa, have you had interactions with the Green Party in England? If so, what are your impressions?
I didn't have much of a contact with the Greens. Obviously, they were quite significant during the general election last year. They did, get quite a big support. And I mean, I do try to follow what they are doing. I know that, they're growing and they're trying to, I think, build a certain kind of membership. And, they're generally, I think, quite a progressive force that also openly criticize labor. And I think, labor needs that. Labor needs to be criticized openly. But at the same time, I am someone who's like, very much, I think we need to be where the trade unions are, and we need to be organized. We can't basically abandon labor, and obviously labor is the main force here in the UK. So instead of maybe just trying to escape like kind of the situation in labor, and I don't know, let's say like transfer towards Greens, I don't think that is a good strategy. But at the same time, I do think we need to pay attention to what Greens are doing, and like also support the progressive struggle that they're trying to introduce and how they challenge labor, and also just kind of paying attention to what might happen more generally. I mean, we also seeing in the UK like the growth of far right, especially Reform, right? And so I think Greens are quite actually effective, doing quite like lots of local work to also debunk a lot of the things that Reform is saying. And so that is, I think, a very important thing that they're doing. So yeah.
Okay, we're hour is up, and you just raised a whole nother question about how do you have a left of the, well, I don't know whether they're center left or center right anymore, the Democrats and the Labor Party under Starmer. And the problem we face in England as well as the United States is single member district winner take all system.
Yeah.
At least you have a parliament where, if you can get some representation in English, the people in Britain are more willing to vote for third parties than in America. So there, you have that discussion about coalitions, but that's a whole nother discussion. And there is a eco-socialist wing of the Greens that seems to be gaining strength in England and Wales. And we had one of those people on here on a podcast back in December. I forget his first name. Hamdosh is his last name. He's a borough representative, actually living in Corbyn's district. And I went door to door in council housing with them.
Yeah.
They do very good organizing, and I'm gonna probably get some more of those folks on to teach us what we need to know in this country, because I think we've lost our local organizing. So there was a question in the chat which I'd like to answer. I think it was addressed to me. Am I going to run in Benali? Yeah, Hamdash. It asks, am I going to run in a future election, House of Representatives? Okay, there it is. I have no plans. And in New York, given what the Democrats did to ballot access, Jill Stein spent $300,000 trying to get 45,000 signatures in 42 days. We got 42,000. That's, a lot of resources for no result. So right now, the Green Party in New York, unless we get the law changed, is not going to run statewide candidates. And my emphasis is urging Greens to focus on local elections. We got to build a foundation. We got to go back to our roots in the 80s and 90s when we organized local groups and created a base on which, Nader was able to run and get on a ballot in the 90s. And I think with that that's what we should be doing during the Trump years. So we come out of them with people, thousands elected to local office, and hopefully people in the state legislature. And then the goal is the House of Representatives when you got strong locals. And that's how we get leverage in national politics. We can platform our issues in presidential races and have the same kind of problems that Ewa was talking about in Poland in terms of getting media coverage and, serious consideration but it's even harder in this country. So I think that's what I'm emphasizing. I'm not ruling out anything, but I have no plans to run for anything right now. My plan is to help younger folks run. I've run 25 times, most of them not at my initiative, but the Greens asked me to. And, I'm getting at the point where I want to say no, I want to help some others run. So that's the answer to that question.
And just like to summarize, like I think, in terms of what kind of stuck with me from these conversations, I think what you said earlier about like also just the importance of having a positive program and the importance of just arguing for things that we believe need to happen and why they need to happen, right? Because like Razem, obviously part of our strategy is parliamentary kind of presence, having those candidates run. But actually, this is not the most important thing that we need to do. The struggle really lies somewhere else. It's getting people politically involved, getting them to like actually get interested in the program, getting them active in their local, branches and joining the party, building some kind of structures, but also just being active in their trade unions, right? I think this is something that I've also heard when you had this episode with the Georgian activist, how during those protests in Georgia, how important it would have been to have those trade unions kind of present and engaged. And that was also a struggle that we had in Poland back in 2020 when we were doing women's organizing. We didn't have the backing of like workers structures. We didn't have a way to the organization that was behind the protest was called All Poland's Women's Strike, but we actually didn't have a proper strike action. We mainly were limited to demonstrations and protests that will eventually wither away. And so, the question really is how do we win those battles in terms of also just our program and the way we argue for it, and how do we get people politically active and rejuvenate those structures that we used to have, with the workers organizing. So I think that is something that I would like to see across Europe. I would like to see in Poland. I would like to see in the US, and hopefully, it's still possible, I think.
Yeah, having been in a Teamster and in other unions for 50 years, I know the problems here. But I also know what you're talking about is possible. And, my one argument with the reform caucuses we've had, like Teamsters for a Democratic Union, Labor Notes, is that they want to reform their unions from business unions into social movement unions, relate to the other progressive social movements, organize the unorganized, democratize their unions. But the other piece of a socialist approach to labor organizing is independent working class political action. And that's been a taboo subject in the American left wing of the labor movement. And I think, that's a taboo we've got to overcome. But I think it's definitely possible, just knowing, the Teamsters and the construction workers I worked with, they're definitely interested in what's going on. They just feel powerless, and the unions are not helping them get educated and organized to act on it. And that's a whole nother discussion. The union bosses want to get reelected, and they don't want the members active and educated because they might elect new leaders. So it's a problem. So anyway, Ewa, thanks very much. I think there was a lot of good information for people to think about and see, what we can take from what the Polish struggle's doing. And, we talked a little bit about the international questions, but that, one of the things I admire about Razem is they're part of these international formations of the green left, the far left, the non-campus left in Europe and Eastern Europe. And that in particular, I think Americans need to think about, because we're, even on the left, very insular and ill-informed about what's going on in other parts of the world. So thanks again. And, maybe later on in the year after your elections, we can maybe come back to Poland and see, what's going on. And, Ukraine next door is, there's talk about a peace settlement. I don't think Trump's going to get it. I don't think Putin is going to. Well, it's whole nother discussion. We're going to talk about that.
Yeah. I'd love to be back. We didn't manage to cover everything that we hoped to, such as like youth movement, different groups that operate outside of Razem. So I think, there's definitely more to cover. But thank you so much for having me. Thank you for all the questions on the live chat. And yeah, hope to stay in touch.
All right, good. So everybody, next week we're going to have a public health activist who's been a socialist for decades named Sam Friedman. And he's, among other things, worked on AIDS prevention and treatment in Ukraine and around the world. He's very concerned about what's the attack on public health by the Trump administration and its inadequate funding, by the Democrats before that. What's going on with COVID, avian flu, measles, and polio starting to spread again because of the vaccine skepticism, and the destruction of basically crippling U.S. aid, which has a lot to do with public health programs, particularly AIDS treatment and prevention in Ukraine and Africa. So Sam will be on next week. He's part of the People's CDC that I've, put links in the chats in previous podcasts. So that's going to be our focus next week. And as I mentioned, we'll have a couple shows about Ukraine as we come to the 3rd anniversary of this terrible war. And so it'll be the same time, Saturdays, 3 p.m. Eastern time. And thanks again, everybody, for being here, and have a good week. And, we got to resist, even if you have to start small and don't stop.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you.